That tornado's carrying a car!
Make up mind. Fight.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Truly a game that's reputation precedes it. It's a game that's been archived in the annals of internet history as one of the single worst Sonic games of all time. A game that's disastrous development, combined with this absolutely horrid critical reception, resulted in its near permanent delisting from online storefronts and a complete change in direction on Sega and Sonic Team's part. A game that, for the past 16 years, has been one of the internet's favorite gaming punchlines. By all accounts, a disaster. However, in recent years, there's been a pretty sizable online push in favor of Sonic 06. People who either grew up playing it, view it as underrated, or just genuinely enjoy it, coming out of the woodwork to defend it, saying that it's overhated and that the internet hate bandwagon around it is unfair. These kinds of movements don't usually come out of nowhere either. There's been plenty of games that were hated in their times that went on to be beloved classics, and Sonic games tend to go through that cycle quite a bit. So that made me interested in actually playing Sonic 06. After all, it's easy to just jump on either bandwagon based on whose voice is the loudest, but actually playing the game for myself and being able to develop an informed opinion, that's what I wanted to do. So in this video, we're going to be giving Sonic 06 a fair, unbiased, retrospective look. We're going to analyze it on its own merits as a video game, removing anything to do with its reception or reputation from the equation. You know what they say, never fear the fall, so it's time to take a deep dive into Sonic 06. Or at least it would have been if I didn't find out that my Xbox 360 no longer reads discs. Yes, as though God himself was trying to keep me from experiencing this game, my recently purchased secondhand 360 completely fried the moment I inserted Sonic 06 into it. It no longer reads any disc. This was obviously a pretty huge roadblock in my quest, and I was at an impasse. So naturally, I bought a second Xbox 360. And my quest was back on. I only found out after the fact that Sonic 06 was actually recently relisted earlier this very year exclusively for 360, but you know, live and learn. So this time, let's take a deep dive into Sonic 06. Let's leap without a net and find if something great has been here all the time. The circumstances behind Sonic 06's development are some of the most well-documented of any famously derided game in history, so for the sake of not just parroting other videos and articles, I'll make the development rundown for this video as quick as I can. Sonic 06 was planned as a series reboot for Sonic, returning the series, quote, to its roots, and being a showcase for both the power of 7th generation consoles and the Havok physics engine. The team had attempted to make a blockbuster Sonic game with a similar vibe to the superhero movies releasing around the same time, and wanted to focus on providing realistic environments and a large story. Silver the Hedgehog, a new character introduced in this game with telekinetic powers, was created out of a desire to showcase the Havok physics engine's power, as the team felt that allowing the player to manipulate physics objects in real time would be a good demonstration of that. Shadow the Hedgehog was also made playable, with his gameplay focusing on combat and vehicles, for which the team designed multiple physics engines. Eventually, it was made evident that development wasn't going smoothly, and head of Sonic Team and famously petulant manchild Yuji Naka decided to leave the company, headhunting several key staff members to form his own company known as Probe. This left Sonic 06's team in a fractured and disorganized state, which was only further compounded by the release of Wii development kits. As you see, Sonic 06 was originally slated for release on all three 7th generation consoles. However, after being exposed to the Wii's less than stellar specs, it was made clear that the game simply wouldn't work on the console. The natural decision, of course, was to splinter Sonic 06's already fractured team even more, moving multiple staff members to the new Wii exclusive Sonic and the Secret Rings. So Sonic 06 at this point was, by all accounts, a highly ambitious series reboot intended on being a blockbuster, while also being the team's first time working for a new and infamously difficult hardware infrastructure being worked on by what was effectively a skeleton team.
That's no good.
This was already bad enough, but there was even more bad news on the horizon, as Sonic 06 absolutely needed to release in time for both the 2006 holiday season and Sonic's approaching 15th anniversary. So this game that was already in a horrible state developmentally was also being made under a severe time crunch. This release date absolutely could not move no matter the cost. The game was eventually revealed at E3 2005, with a playable demo appearing at E3 2006. This demo was actually received quite well and has been noted to be of a far higher quality than the fully released game. Despite this, the game's eventual November 2006 release was when all was laid bare for players to see, with the game being absolutely lambasted by critics and general gamers alike. The primary criticisms were levied at the game's numerous bugs, extremely frequent and long loading times, unruly controls, unfinished animations, and especially its story, which was often compared to an anime in tone, because as we all know, only anime can be bad and convoluted. Regardless, this extremely negative reception eventually resulted in the game being delisted from digital storefronts alongside several other Sonic games, as they were at the time deemed as being damaging to the brand, and the rest was history. Sonic 06 went on to be the biggest bump in the series' history, almost killed the franchise, and resulted in Sega completely pivoting focus of the series going forward. While it's easy to point and laugh at the game, it's important to remember that the developers did not set out at all to make the game the people ultimately got. It's rare in general that games are made deliberately bad with the intent of deceiving consumers, but it's clear that Sonic 06 began development with legitimately noble and grandiose intentions, to be a large series reboot that appealed to all fans while showcasing the power of the new hardware. The team were just dealt a truly awful, unenviable hand, and one of the most commonly echoed sentiments about Sonic 06 is that it really could have been something great. I want to make it clear now that any criticisms I have of this game going forward are not intended to be finger pointing at the developers. They probably did the best that they could given the circumstances. With the development out of the way, let's move on to the game itself, starting with its infamous story. In terms of that story, well, like I said, it's one of the most contentious and widely criticized parts of the game. It's been described as many things, from confusing to ridiculous to overly dark and everything in between, and I think most of those perceptions have to do more with how the game is structured, with Sonic, Shadow, and newcomer Silver all having their own stories that intercept on each other at different points to bring the whole narrative together. It's like a condensed version of Sonic Adventure with its multiple character stories. That said, 06's story is inarguably much more complex than Sonic Adventures, so I'm going to do my best here to try and sum it up. Sonic 06 primarily takes place in and around the city of Soliana, a Venice-inspired city that worships an all-powerful god known as Solaris. On the day of the city's Festival of the Sun, a celebration done to honor and appease Solaris, we are introduced to Princess Elise, a human girl who rules Solaris and whose body secretly acts as a vessel for something known as the Flames of Disaster. Eggman attacks the festival, intent on kidnapping Elise and unleashing these flames, only for Sonic to save and run off with her. We're then briefly introduced to Silver the Hedgehog, a new character with telekinetic abilities who ominously refers to Sonic as the Iblis Trigger. You see, Silver hails from the distant future, where the world has been left in ruin by a powerful monster known as Iblis. Silver is desperate to find a way to save his world from this fate, and eventually meets a mysterious hedgehog known as Mephiles. Mephiles reveals to Silver that the Iblis Trigger, or the person who caused the release of Iblis and the destruction of his world, is none other than Sonic. And Silver, without so much as asking Mephiles' name or for any more details, immediately believes him. Mephiles, whose name by the way is literally in reference to the devil, then sends Silver back in time so that he can find and kill Sonic, preventing this future from taking place. Blaze the Cat is also there, with her backstory controversially being retconned from Sonic Rush, and she doesn't really do anything. I am not exaggerating at all when I say that Blaze never exchanges dialogue with anyone except Silver in this game, and nobody ever acknowledges her presence except him. It's kind of a meme that Blaze is Silver's imaginary friend in this game, which I personally consider canon. Meanwhile, Shadow the Hedgehog is working for Gun and rescues a captured Rouge the Bat. Rouge is captured while attempting to steal the Book of Darkness. Rouge is captured while attempting to steal the Scepter of Darkness, a mysterious relic that supposedly houses a powerful evil. Shadow and Rouge are eventually intercepted by Eggman, resulting in the Scepter of Darkness's destruction and the release of a mysterious Shadow. Eggman, recognizing the threat, immediately pisses his pants and leaves, whereas Shadow and Rouge stay behind. The Shadow that emerged from the Scepter takes the form of Shadow, and re-emerges as a near doppelganger of him, calling himself Mephiles. This is the very same Mephiles that Silver encountered in the future, and he hints at some history between him and Shadow before using his power to send both he and Rouge to the future. Back in Sonic's story, he and Elise successfully evade Eggman's capture for about 5 minutes, before Sonic takes his eyes off of Elise for a few moments and Eggman kidnaps her again. Sonic then teams up with Tails, and the two succeed in finding Elise in Eggman's desert base. After escaping, Sonic and Elise share an extended, very awkward cutscene in which they discuss Elise's past, share some kind words, and have a frolic in a field together. It's at this point that the player might notice the game potentially hinting at romantic feelings between Sonic and Elise, but we'll get to that later. Sonic and Elise then return to Soliana, where they're almost immediately intercepted by Silver, who attempts to kill Sonic. He's interrupted by Amy, who was searching for Sonic as well and had met Silver previously. The two didn't realize that they were searching for the same person because neither of them mentioned they were looking for a blue hedgehog, I guess, and Amy refuses to let Silver kill Sonic. In the midst of this, Elise is kidnapped again by Eggman, and Sonic uses Amy's distraction as an opening to make chase. Silver uses this as a moment of self-reflection, completely ignoring the common sense the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few belief, and wonders if it's really right to kill a single person to prevent the deaths of every single person in the future. Bro. Regardless, Sonic eventually meets up with Tails and Knuckles, the latter of which giving Sonic a video message from Eggman, who offers to return Elise for the ransom of 1 Chaos Emerald. Despite the obvious danger and Tails and Knuckles' hesitance, Sonic willingly walks into this very obvious trap, resulting in him, Tails, and Knuckles being rocketed into the future by Eggman's machine. Luckily, and through sheer unadulterated happenstance and coincidence, the three are sent to the exact same time period and place that Shadow and Rouge were by Mephiles, and the five form a reluctant team intent on getting home. They eventually stumble across a pre-time travel Silver, Mephiles, and Blaze, revealing to Sonic why Silver is trying to kill him, and then use a nearby computer to deduce that Elise was actually killed 2 days after the Festival of the Sun back in their time, which means they need to get back in time to save her. Eventually, the crew discovered 2 Chaos Emeralds, one of which Rouge just has for some reason, and use them to travel back to their own time, except for Shadow, who notices and stays behind to fight Mephiles. Mephiles tells Shadow that in this future, he was blamed for the world's state, with humans turning on him and trapping him forever. Mephiles attempts to goad Shadow into joining him using this information, however it falls on deaf ears and the two fight. Rouge realizes that Shadow is stuck in the future fighting Mephiles, so she finds Omega, gives him a Chaos Emerald, and tells him to stay put for several hundred years so that he can eventually help Shadow in the future. Luckily, Omega manages to rest unopposed for several hundreds of years with the Chaos Emerald inside of him, despite multiple people no doubt seeking them in that time and an apocalypse happening along the way, and Omega shows up to help Shadow in the future, with the two defeating Mephiles and causing him to flee through a time portal. Shadow and Omega follow him through and go back to the present. Shadow seeks out Eggman, who tells him in a weirdly friendly and low-key conversation that, to learn the truth of what's going on, Shadow needs to learn about an accident that occurred 10 years ago known as the Solaris Project. Shadow eventually just kinda stumbles across Sonic and Silver, who are about to fight, and interrupts them to give Sonic a chance to escape and find Elise. Shadow and Silver end up fighting instead, with Shadow having a clear upper hand, resulting in him telling Silver that he can uncover the truth about his future if they travel 10 years into the past. Doing so with Chaos Control, the two witness the circumstances of the Solaris Project firsthand. This science experiment was being enacted on Solaris itself, Soliana's god, with the intent of granting Soliana the ability to control time and undo all of humanity's mistakes. It goes very south with the head researcher, also Elise's father, being killed, and both Iblis and Mephiles being created and released from Solaris' body as a result of the accident. This ultimately reveals to Silver that it was this event, and not Sonic, that caused the release of Iblis and the destruction of his future. The pair are then given the Scepter of Darkness by Elise's dying father, a vessel capable of sealing Mephiles, which Shadow does, revealing why Mephiles had known who he was when they met in the future. They also seal Iblis inside a young Elise's soul, which turns out to be the flames of disaster that Eggman was seeking. The two then leave both the Scepter of Darkness and a Chaos Emerald behind with the young Elise, and travel back into the future. It's also revealed why, throughout the game, it's repeatedly iterated that Elise absolutely cannot cry. If she does, it'll unleash Iblis. Forget the fact that her father just died and all, she's never cried. Don't worry about it. Silver, back in the present time, reunites with his imaginary friend and ultimately decides to help Sonic now that he knows the truth. The trio set out to save Elise from Eggman, but in an incredibly dark turn of events, are too late, with both Elise and Eggman being killed by the latter's ship malfunctioning and crashing. Fortunately, time travel has been thrown around like a football at this point in the story, so Sonic and Silver simply travel a day back, with Sonic saving Elise from Eggman for one final time. So yeah, Elise and Eggman fucking died in this story and came back, and it didn't mean anything. Anyway, back at Shadow's side of things, him, Rouge, and Omega have set out to create a new Scepter of Darkness to seal Mephiles again, and eventually chase him into his desert temple base. Shadow and Mephiles have one last fight before it's made apparent that he's grown too strong to be sealed by the Scepter of Darkness. He tries one last time to goad Shadow into joining him, to which Shadow responds with the best worst final line of any story I've ever heard.
If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have.
Shadow takes off his power inhibitor rings, which have never been consciously acknowledged as anything other than bracelets in the video game series before this, with his story ending as he blasts through an army of Mephiles clones. Finally, Silver's campaign concludes with him and Blaze venturing back into their future, intent on finally putting down Iblis. The two ultimately do, with Blaze needing to sacrifice herself to act as a vessel to seal it. Silver's imaginary friend is gone, but his future is saved. Please reconnect controller. But wait, there's more! In the game's climactic last story, it's revealed that nobody really did anything about Mephiles, and he pops right up and launches an energy beam through an unaware Sonic's chest, killing him instantly. Sonic dies in this story. Elise, grief-stricken over Sonic's death, finally cries, releasing Iblis and allowing Mephiles to fuse back with it, creating the ultimately powerful Solaris. This event causes a time rift to open, conveniently transporting every major character in the game to the same place in space-time for no reason. Eggman reveals that Solaris is about to destroy time itself, and due to being an omnipresent being that exists in all times at once, defeating it is impossible. So yeah, things seem pretty rough with Sonic dead and everyone else about to join him, but luckily Elise feels Sonic's presence on the wind, concluding that his soul is still alive. The remaining characters then set out across space-time in the worst level in the game to gather the Chaos Emeralds to resurrect Sonic. Through the Chaos Emeralds and a kiss from Elise, a human teenage girl, Sonic is revived in his super form. He transforms Silver and Shadow into their super forms as well, and the three set out to destroy Solaris' consciousness as a whole. They succeed, causing Solaris to revert to its base form as a small white flame. Sonic tells Elise that if she extinguishes the flame, the entire events of the game will be undone and everyone will be saved. Elise, though, in a massively childish and selfish moment, states that she doesn't care what happens to the world so long as she can be with Sonic, and refuses to snuff the flame out. Sonic reminds her one last time to just smile, putting her tantrum at ease and causing her to blow out the flame. This ultimately causes the entire events from Sonic 06 to be expunged from series timeline, making everything ultimately pointless. Okay, so, I've heard for years that this game's story is absolutely dreadful. A confusing, overcomplicated, borderline creepy mess from start to finish. And now that I've actually experienced it in full through the means that it was originally intended, I'm sorry to say that I mostly agree. And honestly, it's got less to do with the individual story beats itself and more to do with how the story is structured and presented. This is an incredibly fractured and confusing narrative, and following it in real time while actually playing the game is a nightmare. The constant abuse of time travel as a plot element muddles things even further, with characters jumping to and from different time periods so rapidly that keeping track of an active timeline is borderline impossible. It's constantly riddled with contrivances and coincidences to help move things along, with stuff like Sonic and crew being sent to the same time as Shadow and Rouge despite being transported by entirely different means, characters just being in the right place at the right time constantly with no explanation, Omega somehow surviving for hundreds of years without a Chaos Emerald inside of him, and the complete lack of clarity onto why Mephiles is still around to kill Sonic after the main three campaigns just being a few examples. The characters are also generally presented in super unappealing ways. Sonic is written almost like a cheesy anime protagonist rather than, well, Sonic, with him always busting out these goofy as hell
Your smile. That's all I need.
and
Nothing starts until you take action.
type lines. It's really weird and out of character to see Sonic characterized as this sincere and mushy. He's got none of that classic Sonic edge or attitude to him. He's just a really mushy, sincere protagonist. Silver is a huge idiot, as he doesn't take a single moment to question whether or not he's being led astray by Mephiles, and is constantly yelling in an extremely whiny tone about his world. I understand that the circumstances he's facing could naturally lead to desperation, but it comes at the cost of an enjoyable character or performance. He just comes off as incredibly gullible for most of the game. Shadow is, to be honest, the only character in the game who I actually enjoy, since he's pretty much the only one who knows what's going on and is taking a proactive effort to deal with the problems at hand. His dialogue is super cheesy, but in an enjoyably cheesy way rather than whatever the hell Sonic is. Also, Sonic's story means nothing. This is a game that primarily centers its plot around the situation with Mephiles, Iblis, and Solaris, yet Sonic only tangentially interacts with any of them, and his fights with Eggman ultimately don't mean anything. Hell, him saving Elise at the end of the game kind of isn't really an ending, since he's chronologically killed by Mephiles almost immediately after anyways. Sonic's story doesn't have a proper conclusion. He beats Eggman, but the overlying problems that the other characters are facing still very much exist. As for the side characters, most of the Sonic series regulars are pretty bog standard, but I really want to focus on Elise. She is such a weird character to introduce into the Sonic series. A human princess who serves as a damsel in distress for Sonic to rescue. I swear, every single time Sonic takes his eyes off of her for more than a few moments, she gets kidnapped. There are cutscenes where Sonic is distracted by like 3 robots and Eggman swoops in and steals her. This, combined with her super corny, anime as hell, appealing to Japanese audiences' helpless princess shtick, make her ultimately a character who feels more like deadweight and a liability than anything. The notion that if she cries, Iblis will be unleashed is also super weird and poorly explained. Does it only apply to emotional crying? If she gets a scratch on the inside of her nose and her eyes water, will Iblis come out? Has she gone 10 years without her eyes watering at all? It's really not elaborated on. And we can't talk about Elise without talking about, obviously, her and Sonic's relationship. Elise clearly develops what is, by all accounts, a deeply romantic infatuation with Sonic, and it's pretty creepy. Not only because it's obviously a human girl and an anthropomorphic hedgehog, but also because I feel like Sonic never really reciprocates it. Like, he's obviously nice and sweet to her, but it never comes off as though Sonic has the same feelings for her that she does for him. It just kind of feels like Sonic is being a typical hero, and Elise is being a creepy obsessor. There's also, obviously, the kiss, and this is one of the most infamous parts of the game. Sonic is resurrected from the dead by a kiss from a human girl. This is obviously fucking weird, and I want to dive into just why it's so weird. After all, media has regularly depicted stuff like this between films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Sonic's original pitch girlfriend Madonna. Why does Elise and Sonic's relationship go too far when these things don't? Well, I feel like it ultimately comes down to presentation and intent. In those other examples, the relationships are presented as comedic, playing off of the intrinsic humor that comes from the concept of a voluptuous human bombshell dating a funny cartoon animal. There is a self-awareness to them and irony. On the flip side, Elise and Sonic's relationship in 06 is taken deathly seriously, and treated with the same amount of earnest sincerity as some other very serious love stories. There's no humor, it never acknowledges the ridiculousness of what it's presenting, and that's why it's so creepy. Another issue I have with this game's story is just how dark it is. It's true that Sonic games, especially since the Dreamcast days, have regularly featured darker and more serious narratives, but Sonic 06 feels like a step too far in that direction. The entire story centering around a Terminator-esque dystopian future, the multiple character deaths throughout, the overall heavy tone, it just feels out of place, even in a series that's regularly flirted with more serious subject matter. Also, why is everyone in Soliana? I get that this is a reboot and we're meant to believe that the characters just kind of exist here, but considering that the characterization is written with the intent of the player knowing who these characters are and what their relationships are like, it feels kind of weird to have them all just hanging out in this random Italian city. So yeah, as much as I wanted to give it a fair chance, I just don't love Sonic 06's story. It's an incredibly convoluted, fractured narrative, bogged down even further by some dreadful characterization and some truly out-of-place dark elements. It's a shame too, because I like a lot of what this game contributed to the series at large. I like Silver, especially in more recent games. I think Mephiles is a neat villain, and I think the concept of a more serious blockbuster-esque Sonic game has potential. It just sadly didn't land here for me. This kind of goes double for the presentation as well. Now, I'm not going to be nearly as harsh or critical here, as I know that the team was extremely crunched for time and resources, and I'm sure that polishing the visuals and animations wasn't really their primary focus. That's totally understandable, so I'm not going to heavily fault the game for stuff like pop-in or seemingly unfinished animations and cutscenes. What I will point out, though, is how barren and empty a lot of the game feels. Both of its hub worlds are just big boxes with loose geometry mouse dropped around, and it makes finding where to go in each character's story pretty cumbersome. This also applies to the levels, which oftentimes feel like they're not fully utilizing the massive space afforded to them, leading to them feeling empty at best and downright confusing at worst. The game's overall graphics and art style aren't that impressive either, but I completely understand most of it given what the team was working with. I've seen some people say that the game looks like an upscaled PS2 game with muddy textures, basic animations, extremely jaggy shadows, and an all-around lack of graphical polish, but considering the circumstances of its development and its extremely early release in the 7th generation of consoles, it makes sense. Very early games on new consoles generally don't look as great as later ones in general, since it takes developers time to fully fully understand the infrastructure of each new piece of hardware. The game runs on the same consoles that plays games like Gears of War Judgment and The Last of Us, but those were both comparatively late in their own consoles' lifespans. One thing I will comment on though is the character designs. Sonic 06 featured redesigns for several characters from minor to major, and I just don't think they look all that great. All of the actual Sonic characters look super lanky and washed out in terms of their colors, and Eggman's redesign is one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. I understand that they were trying to make them blend in more amongst the game's other realistic humans, but my argument is, why not just make the humans look more like the Sonic characters instead? Kind of like what Sonic Unleashed did, rather than compromising long-standing solid character designs to better fit an ultimately futile stylistic vision. As for those realistic humans, none of them look great either. Most of them look like they're ripped straight out of a PS2 game, and their designs are often just different clothing, hats, or hair on the same models. I know I said I wouldn't be criticizing the game's graphics much out of respect for what the team went through developing the game, but considering that the inclusion of realistic humans was a conscious stylistic choice that the team committed to, I feel like it's worth addressing. Elise is definitely the best looking human character, and that's really not a compliment. The game also features fully CGI animated cutscenes produced by Blur Studio, and these are kind of inconsistent. Some of them, like the ones in Sonic's story and each character's introductory cutscenes, look excellent and brilliantly crafted, while others later in the game were clearly more budgeted, and they end up looking straight out of the CG cutscenes and things like Sonic Heroes with just a bit more polish. I want to stress that this isn't a huge deal, again considering the circumstances of the game's development, but it is something to note. In terms of audio, Sonic 06 is kind of a mixed bag. A lot of key things in gameplay feel like they lack appropriate impact due to poor sound design, leading to overall lackluster game feel, and the voice acting really isn't that great across the board. It's not like the actors aren't talented either, it's the Sonic X cast, with Lacey Chabert, also known as Season 1 Meg Griffin, showing up to play Elise. The problem is ultimately the script and the direction. The deliveries of a lot of these lines are distractingly hokey and sometimes actively annoying, especially Pete Capella as Silver, and it oftentimes feels more like you're listening to voice actors reading a script than you are listening to characters in a story. Not everyone gives a bad performance though. I don't love Jason Griffith's Sonic in this game, mainly due to his direction, but his shadow is still on point, and Mike Pollock brings it as Eggman as well as he always does, serving a more grounded performance than usual due to the tone of the game, and I'd even say Dan Green delivers a good performance as Mephiles, despite him really villain voicing it up. Everyone else is either perfectly fine to actively unenjoyable. Now, I know I just discussed a lot of negatives, so I want to stress that what I'm about to say is completely earnest and sincere. Sonic 06 has an excellent soundtrack. This is straight up one of my new favorite Sonic OSTs after playing the game. It's that good. The standout track is obviously His World, which is probably my favorite main Sonic vocal track of all time. Which version, you ask? Both. They're both great. I know a lot of people joke about it being butt rock and outdated and stuff like that, but music is such a subjective thing that people enjoy for such a wide variety of reasons that I have no shame admitting that I love His World. Shadow's theme, All Hail Shadow, is cheesy as all hell, but I kind of love it for that, and Johnny Gioeli's vocals are as good as ever. And Silver's theme, Dreams of an Absolution, is also pretty good, sounding nothing like the other tracks in the game, which gives both it and the character a unique identity. And I want to stress too that it's not just the vocal character themes. Sonic 06's ambient and level themes are also really great, dare I even say underrated. Some standouts for me are Flame Core's theme, which features an excellent guitar riff in its second half, both of Wave Ocean's themes being bops, Crisis City's theme being just as hectic and bombastic as the level it's featured in, Aquatic Bass featuring those really cool vocalizations and distortion effects, and even the soft rendition of His World that plays on the results screen being really nice. The game just has a great soundtrack all around, and I'd even say that the music leads to some unironically really nice narrative synergy in some levels, like going through Flame Core at the end of Silver's campaign, with Silver's only goal left being to finally put an end to Iblis, and having that driving guitar playing in the background. It's actually really cool. I wish the game featured more stuff like this because the soundtrack really is amazing. So, we've said a lot about 06's story, presentation, and music now, and while I'm not huge on most of it save for the music, the real reason behind Sonic 06's current reputation falls squarely on its gameplay. This is probably the most hotly contested aspect of the game in terms of modern discussions. Some people insist that the game is absolutely terrible, borderline unplayable, while others adamantly defend it and say that it's actually really fun. So let's dive into Sonic 06's gameplay and see where we stand on the issue. At a base, Sonic 06 is structured very similarly to Sonic Adventure 1, with multiple character stories comprised of navigating hub worlds to reach individual levels. Within these hub worlds, players can interact with NPCs, purchase items and upgrades for their characters, and take on side missions to earn more rings to spend on those upgrades. In the levels, the players will be using their characters' individual abilities to navigate their surroundings, defeat enemies, and eventually reach a goal ring. The player is then scored and ranked based on their performance in the level, with higher ranks granting more rings. The first thing to note about Sonic 06's moment-to-moment gameplay is its control. Each character has a distinct feel, and for the most part, none of them feel that bad, all things considered. I've heard for years that Sonic 06 is borderline uncontrollable and that your character would slip around at the slightest tilt of the stick, but in reality, it feels like a slightly more contained version of Sonic Heroes. The sensitivity is super high at a base, and it can be easy to lose control of Sonic or Shadow if you're moving too fast, but the game is generally fine in terms of movement. The only time it really gets difficult or unruly is in the sections that require very tight or precise movement, or God forbid any angle changes. These parts where you have to run on walls had me pissing my pants for the whole game, because I swear I never truly figured out how to control them. It was 100% a gamble on whether or not I survived them. Silver generally doesn't have these problems, as his gameplay is focused more on slow-paced physics manipulation and light puzzle solving. As for those physics, Sonic 06 is interesting as an early 7th generation game in that it loves throwing physics objects at the player. It's kind of funny that the game was initially positioned as a showcase for the power of 7th generation consoles, because it chugs to hell and back whenever too much is moving at once. This isn't my recording software, this is the game. It makes a decision to base an entire character's gameplay around controlling physics objects extra puzzling, since they barely work. It's especially irritating that the rings that fall out of the characters after being hit have physics for some reason, meaning that they can be blasted away by enemies or just simply pushed away by the player attempting to collect them again. And speaking of things that barely work, one of the biggest aspects that people throw against Sonic 06 is its supposed abundance of bugs. People talk about this game like it's constantly glitching out and throwing unavoidable deaths at the player through errors, and I can comfortably say that that is half true. In terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, I actually didn't encounter too much in the ways of gameplay affecting or life-losing bugs. Most of the glitches that you'll encounter are fairly benign and harmless, basically being just funny visuals that come down to the game's broken physics. Some of them have to be actively triggered by the player and aren't easy to come across naturally. There isn't too much in the ways of game-breaking bugs, just harmless jank that looks funny in a YouTube video. What will kill the player, however, is seemingly scripted and deliberately designed sequences just not working as intended. One of the most common criticisms of modern Sonic games is how railroady they can be, with the game often steering the player through loops and speedy sections, and 06 kind of does this, with the distinction that they're just prone to breaking. You can be flung to your death on these with no warning, and due to them largely being scripted otherwise, there's really nothing you can do about it. This is only compounded by the game's extremely punishing life system. Now, using lives and game overs in a game from 2006 is already a little archaic, as some platformers by this point had been phasing them out, but 06 commits really hard to it in the worst way. If you run out of lives, you're not sent back to the beginning of the level, you're not sent back to the cutscene before, you're sent back to the story select screen. This means that if the player hasn't manually saved between their most recent completed level and losing all of their lives, they're sent back to the end of that most recently completed level. If you did any side missions, collected any rings, or made it 99% of the way through the level, you're doing it all over again. This can be circumvented by manually saving after literally everything that you do, but that shouldn't really be necessary to begin with. A lot of the levels are damn long too, so you're losing a lot of progress if you get a game over. And all of this is made infinitely worse by one of Sonic 06's most infamous aspects, its loading screen. For whatever reason, the loading times in this game are both extremely frequent and extremely long. The game takes it upon itself to load everything individually, be it levels, individual sections of those levels, cutscenes, different parts of the overworld, or even NPC dialogue. It's well documented that accepting a side mission in this game is a ridiculous time sink, requiring that the game both load the NPC's dialogue and then load again for the actual mission. It might not sound like much, but considering that the individual loading screens are often upwards of a minute long, it can get pretty arduous. Not only that, but upon losing a side mission or getting a game over, you have to go through all of those loading screens again. For reference, I was playing through this game with its data downloaded to my 360, which generally cuts down on loading times for most games, and it was still upwards of a minute to get into each individual section. Those side missions I mentioned are generally really weird too. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it does add a bit of humor to what's otherwise a really bleak game, but it's hard to ignore how odd some of these NPCs and their requests are. Between the Soliana boys tasking Sonic with finding them all, the ghost of a deceased pilot asking you to beat his record, or a crazy Sonic fan named Sonic Man challenging you to a race, you never really know what you're gonna get. After a while, doing these side missions becomes pretty pointless, as you'll likely have enough rings to buy whatever upgrades you need just from playing through the game, and some of them are just prone to breaking and not working, but they're still there if you want a distraction or some more rings. There's a lot more we could say about the moment-to-moment gameplay, but as a lot of it comes down to individual moments and mechanics in each character's respective story, why don't we look at those stories one by one? Let's do a quick rundown of each of the main playable characters, their mechanics, and what makes them unique. Starting with Sonic, who's probably my least favorite of the three. Sonic's story generally revolves around his constant pursuit of Eggman to rescue Elise. His levels are usually characterized by an emphasis on speed, platforming, and on-rails Mach speed sections. Like I said, Sonic's story is probably my least favorite of the three, and it mainly comes down to a distinct lack of polish present in his story. For whatever reason, it might just be because you'd be the least familiar with the game at this point out of the three, but Sonic's campaign feels far and away the jankiest out of the three. It's the primary place where broken sequences, occasional bugs, and unavoidable deaths rear their ugly heads, and a lot of the levels just aren't that enjoyable. Sonic's primary gimmick is the presence of Mach speed sections, which are on-rails auto-runner sections that see Sonic running towards a specific goal. I am not exaggerating when I say that these are probably among the worst parts of the entire game, as they're extremely buggy, unpolished, unforgiving, and plagued by design that asks too much of the player too quickly. If the player nicks anything along the way, they'll immediately lose all of their rings and briefly lose control of Sonic, and if they clip anything else after that, they die. This is further compounded by the jumping mechanics in these sections, which for whatever reason, lock you into your jump arc upon pressing the A button. You cannot control yourself in the air during these sections. This results in an extremely small amount of wiggle room in terms of player error, with a slightly misaligned jump often resulting in almost certain death. It was common in my playthrough for me to enter these sections with 5 or 6 lives, only to eventually get a game over due to the abundance of jank on these sections. They're like a much more difficult, much less polished, much harder to control version of the boost formula games, without any of the charm or opportunities for speed gain as those games. Aside from the Mach speed sections and basic platforming, Sonic's levels generally tend to feature large amounts of level-by-level gimmicks and mechanics. In some levels, Sonic will be carrying Elise, which surprisingly doesn't affect his physical ability or moveset at all, and grants him a temporary shield that he can use to defeat enemies and travel over water or sand. Other levels will feature things like ropes that need to be jumped off of, plant stems that need to be swung from, and objects and obstacles randomly falling from the sky to damage the player. A lot of these gimmicks generally lack polish and clarity as to their function, which can lead to a lot of deaths. One I particularly want to note is the snowboard at the beginning of White Acropolis, which I swear has, like, no controls. Like, it feels like everything it does is random. It can stop on a dime on a snowy incline, it can do all sorts of crazy turns and spins, it's just wild, man. Sonic will also occasionally hand off his sections to other playable characters, most notably Tails, Knuckles, Amy, and one-time Silver. Tails is presented very strangely in his playable sections, with his flight having an arbitrary height cap placed on it, and his primary attack being the ability to toss dummy ring bombs. These rings that come out of these bombs not only muddle the screen, make it hard to find real rings, and generally get in the way, but as physics objects also slow the game down. Knuckles is presented about as normally as he usually is, with gliding, climbing, and punching, but his sections are notably jank, with it infamously being difficult to detach yourself from walls for no real reason, and his aerial attacks having a weird offset to their angle. Amy is presented really weirdly as well, since despite her trademark hammer being here and exceptionally clunky to use, her primary ability is turning invisible. It's weird. This is never explained, by the way. As for Silver, we'll get to him in a bit. Sonic's story also features one of my personal least favorite moments in the entire game, where the player has to pass 3 trials in order to enter Kingdom Valley, which is also, funnily enough, one of the worst levels in the entire game. These trials consist of a very mindless maze of portals that's for some reason described as the Test of Intelligence, a test where the player has to choose between their love for Amy or Elise for some reason, and most notably for our purposes, a test where the player is tasked with defeating a large number of enemies with no rings, thus granting them 1 hit to death. This is difficult for a few reasons, not the least of which being that several enemies have access to both homing rockets and instant gunfire, which can both immediately kill the player before they can react. Plus, if the player loses a single life here, they have to go through about 4 loading screens to get back in. And if they dare to get a game over without manually saving, then they have to do all 3 trials again. I also want to mention Sonic's gems, which are unlockable items that the player can buy with rings. These were designed with the intent of having their usage limited by a glowing meter that's literally always on screen, but for some reason that's only known to one solitary developer at Sega, the meter never actually goes down, resulting in the gem's usage being effectively infinite. Because of this, the red gem, which allows the player to slow down time, and the purple gem, which allows the player to shrink Sonic and gain infinite jumps for some reason, both quickly become unlimited cheese mechanics that you can easily cheat the rest of Sonic's story with. Sonic also has a few boss battles in his story, most of them being pretty harmless fights against Eggman's robots, but there are 2 I want to highlight in specific: the fight against Silver and the fight against Iblis. The fight against Silver is one of the most widely reviled parts of the game due to Silver's ability to instantly command grab the player with telekinesis, toss them away, cause them to pick up a single ring, and do it again, eventually locking the player into an infinite, but I beat it on my first try.
Hey yo, what the f***?
It might just be because the Silver fight is ingrained in my mind from all the playthroughs and reviews I've watched of this game, but it's really not that bad if you know what you're doing. Just stay away from him, wait for him to yell, signaling that he's picked up a nearby item, attack, and run away to repeat. If you know how the fight works and don't attempt to dive bomb right in against a character with telekinesis, it's not that bad. The fight against Iblis, though, is that bad. You fight this boss in multiple character stories, and it's just as slow and lame each time. It's borderline scripted, with Iblis only becoming open to attack when very specific circumstances are met, and in between, you're just kind of standing around waiting for something to happen. It's not great, and the level before it, Flame Core, is also terrible, despite its music being great, so that's a thing. Overall, I'd say that Sonic's story is easily my least favorite of the 3. It's bogged down by jank, frustrating gimmicks, a few terrible boss fights, and the atrocious Mach Speed sections. However, this poses a question. Since Sonic's story is often the only one that people play in this game, and is a major contributing factor to its reputation, maybe Silver and Shadow stories will be better. Let's find out. Now, despite order of familiarity and the story select menu indicating otherwise, I say that you're better off playing Silver's story second over Shadow's. Not only because it explains what's going on Silver's side of things during Sonic's story and elaborates on the Mephiles and Iblis plotlines, but also because it makes the ending of Shadow's story more impactful. Regardless, Silver is a character primarily based around his telepathy and physics object manipulation. His gameplay is generally slower and more methodical than Sonic's, with a bigger focus on individual enemy encounters and light puzzle solving. Silver's base running speed is much slower than both Sonic's and Shadow's, which I actually don't mind, as it makes navigating areas easier and more manageable. Silver's main mechanic is his ability to pick up and throw physics objects to attack enemies and affect the environment around him. Doing this consumes his meter, which unlike Sonic's actually does work properly. He's able to pick up boxes, rocks, enemy projectiles, vases, and anything else that has physics. It's a neat mechanic on paper, but leads to some very boring and slow-paced encounters. As Silver starts out with no way to directly damage enemies himself, he relies entirely on using environmental objects and countering enemy attacks to fight. Because of this, Silver's combat sections involve a whole lot around waiting for enemies to fire and for physics objects to respawn if you use them all without killing anything. After a while though, Silver earns access to a downward slam that stuns most enemies, leaving them immediately vulnerable to being picked up and tossed, killing them instantly. This creates a sort of opposite problem where fights go from being too boring to being too mindless. Silver's other primary gimmick is his levitation, levitation, which allows him to briefly hover in the air so long as he has meter to spare. It's well documented in this game that just mashing the hover button in midair allows you to traverse more distance while using less meter than just hovering normally, and I can absolutely attest to this strategy's effectiveness. It's not 100% foolproof, as you do maintain more vertical distance by just hovering normally, but more times than not, mashing is the way to go. Silver's story additionally features brief moments of the player needing to interact with marked spots on the ground to interact with the environment, which strike me as pretty pointless since they just add time to the process of walking forward and proceeding in a level. As I've grown older, I've become less and less patient with these interact with a thing that's not even a puzzle to unlock a path. It's basically just a roadblock and walking forward sections in games, and that's exactly what these silver sections are. Plus, some of them just kind of break and don't even work properly. Overall, it just feels pretty unnecessary. Due to traveling across the same levels as Sonic, Silver also experiences his own versions of a lot of Sonic's level-specific gimmicks as well, and most of them do not work great. This log, for example, is so finicky and hard to jump off of. His story also features the infamous ball puzzle, a notoriously awful and barely functional physics puzzle, which can thankfully be skipped by easily clipping through a nearby door with a box. For reference, I was able to do this very easily without a guide after only a few tries. Silver also occasionally hands off his levels to Blaze, who's probably my least favorite character in the entire game to control. Her attacks are all mobile dashes and spins, which send her every which way and make orienting yourself for platforming exceptionally difficult. Overall, Silver's campaign is one that I like in concept, being a slower, more methodical story to offset Sonic and Shadow's speed, but it's hampered by some technical flubs and some lackluster design of his key abilities. I'd say I like it more overall than Sonic's campaign, but not by much. Let's see how Shadow fares. Shadow's campaign primarily sets its focus on combat and brief vehicle sections. And by combat, I mean mashing the A button after a homing attack to deal a brief stagnant combo on enemies. I both like and dislike this, since while it does slow down the pace of Shadow's gameplay significantly, it also makes dealing with generic mobs of enemies much easier and faster. You only really need one homing attack per enemy. It does make going for singular homing attacks to, say, traverse obstacles trickier, since the prime animation he does for the combo makes it so you can't immediately jump away. This actually makes Shadow's version of the fight against Silver way worse than Sonic's, since you actually don't have enough time to get away from him after a successful homing attack before he grabs you, but it's still not too terrible if you decide to spin kick him instead of homing attack him. Shadow also has access to different chaos abilities, which can be purchased as upgrades in between levels, and I'll be honest, I barely used any of these outside of scripted story events where they're required. I don't even really remember what they specifically do. I just know that the meter required for using them takes forever to charge, and that the game mandates using them for most of Shadow's boss fights. His main chaos ability, Chaos Spear, is a projectile that can be used while in the air to stun enemies, but its usefulness is hampered significantly by most of the enemies you'd actually want to use it on being immune to it. Shadow's story also featured, as I briefly mentioned before, vehicle sections, which are a mixed bag. Some of them are perfectly manageable, brief, and unobtrusive, while others are actively frustrating. The hang glider and boat sections in particular are rough, with the hang glider featuring nearly unavoidable damage regularly, and the boat regularly insta-killing the player with equally unavoidable falling pillars that blindside them. That's totally fair. Doing these levels basically comes down to memorizing the layouts and paths you can get safely through with, but considering the game's overly punishing life system, it's not that easy to chart a course with trial and error. Just like the previous two campaigns, Shadow will also occasionally hand off his gameplay to either Rouge or Omega, with the latter being fine and the former being bad. Rouge suffers from a lot of the same problems as Knuckles, such as getting stuck on walls, and her primary attack is launching these incredibly slow and finicky bombs at enemies. I don't understand why this game thinks most of Sonic's signature characters can't fight. It's ridiculous. Omega fares significantly better, not only because he features the same mashing hover exploit that Silver does, but also because his aerial attack shreds enemies. I swear I couldn't figure out his grounded attack, though. Otherwise, Shadow's story is pretty much Sonic's with a slightly better story and occasional boss fights against Mephiles. Out of the three, I'm inclined to say that Shadow's is my favorite, even with the vehicles, due mostly to his more robust abilities and lack of significant jank. And that's all three stories. I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Oh right, the last story. So I've said a few times in this video that parts of this game were among or close to the worst parts of the game, but I am speaking in complete earnest sincerity when I say that the last story of Sonic 06 is not only the worst part of this game, but also completely unironically, one of the worst parts of any game I've played in a long time. At a base, it's a gauntlet of 7 stages as each of the game's non-Sonic playable characters with 1 character per stage. The player is required to navigate all 7 of these stages in one clean go, and should they get a game over, they're starting all the way from the beginning, complete with needing to skip every cutscene again, with a loading screen for each one. This would be frustrating to say the least as is, but it's compounded by a few additional mechanics. One is the time limit. As space-time collapses around the player, the screen will begin distorting and eventually killing the player, with them needing to touch these specific checkpoints to offset it. These things can be set super far apart, requiring that the player basically speedrun to survive. The other mechanic is the instant kill voids that open up throughout the story that will immediately kill the player on contact regardless of how many rings they have. These not only spawn completely randomly without any warning, but also drag players in when they get near them and can blindside the player with unavoidable damage and deaths by spitting out projectiles. This part at the end of Shadow Stage, which is also the very last stage of the last story, where the player has to run along the side of a wall with one of these things in their way, is probably the most scared I've ever been in any game. It was the final trial of my Sonic 06 run. And keep in mind that if you get a game over at any point, you're restarting the last story from the very beginning. And capping this game off is a very uneventful boss fight against Solaris, where despite some excellent music and presentation, the stakes in the fight being huge, and this gargantuan threat of an immortal, omnipresent god being the opponent, is hampered by an overly simple gameplay style and an overall lack of cinematic impact. Silver throws rock, Sonic dashes in, and Shadow throws chaos spears. Repeat for 15 minutes and you've completed Sonic 06. What a game. So, Sonic 06. This was a game that I had heard absolute horror stories about for years. And now that I've actually played it to completion myself, what is my final verdict? What is my grand take on Sonic 06? My opinion to set me apart from the crowd?
The game is bad.
But it's not bad for the reasons I've always been told. It's not bugs, glitches, overwhelming jank, or anything like that that drags the game down. In fact, at a base level, I'd say Sonic 06 is perfectly playable and even has some more entertainment value to it than some worse games in the series. It's the distinct lack of polish combined with some very questionable deliberate design choices that bring this game down. Things like the unforgiving life system, the controls in the Mach speed sections, the plot, and the last story's design are not bugs. Even if they were the result of a crunch development, they were added due to conscious decisions. This, alongside the game's lack of polish and occasional jank, make the experience of actually playing through it solo without friends to laugh along with it a laborious slog at best and actively frustrating at worst. That said, my sincerest empathies still lie with the development team. This isn't the worst 360 or PS3 game or even the worst Sonic game. It's a game that clearly had wide, sweeping ambitions that were horrifically squashed by some truly unenviable and awful development circumstances. The team truly did the best that they could. It's often echoed that, with the proper time to stew, this game could have been great or even the best Sonic game. And while I'm inclined to disagree that it would have been great to that extent, a version of this game that was given the chance to actually finish would be a sight to behold. That's why things like Project 06 by Ian Morris are so admirable. A dedicated fan taking time out of their life to recreate Sonic 06 into the game it ultimately could have been. It's truly incredible and makes me wish for Sega to take another stab at this game with more time and more resources. Give us the Sonic 06 that should have been, and let us all forget the one that was. Sonic 06 is a tragic tale of game development at its worst. A grand, well-intentioned celebration of a beloved series legacy being horribly abused and shut down by corporate greed, baffling decisions, and a lack of proper support, leading to a game that'll always be remembered as the worst that beloved series had ever put out. A game that caused a permanent change in the direction for that series. A game that almost acted as the bad apple that spoiled the bunch in that series. A game that almost killed that series. A series that game was created in an effort to celebrate. Sonic 06 is not the worst game of all time, nowhere close, but it'll always be a reminder that everything can go wrong in game development, especially when high-up meddling comes into play. Give people the time and resources they need, and they'll likely create great things, but give people no time, no resources, and most importantly, no respect for their talent, and they'll create Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Hey, thanks for watching. This video was definitely an undertaking. I think between playing through the game, writing the script, and editing, this video took me well over a month to make, which is a huge time sink compared to most of my videos. So if you enjoyed by any stretch, I'd really appreciate a like or a subscribe. If not, it's totally fine. I understand, you know, subscribing to smaller YouTubers can be a bit of a gamble, but I am trying to get this channel over 500 subs so I can unlock community posts. So once again, if you enjoyed and feel like throwing a sub my way, that's perfectly fine, and I would very much appreciate it. But if not, I understand. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Thanks and cheers.
And if you put the time in, he'll put you to the test. He's like a running man, and his world war is less. And if you want to test